If Genesis 1 is an account of the creation of the world, why is the world recreated in Genesis 2? Dr. Bart Ehrman joins me today to talk about whether these accounts can be understood as one single story or if something else is going on. Welcome to Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman, the only show where a 6-time New York Times best-selling author and world-renowned Bible scholar uncovers the many fascinating, little-known facts about the New Testament, the historical Jesus, and the rise of Christianity. I'm your host, Megan Lewis. Let's begin. Welcome back to Misquoting Jesus, everybody. Today we are talking about the creation accounts found in Genesis 1 and 2. We also have some listeners' questions at the end, so be sure to stick around for all of those. Bart, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing well. Busy as always. As happens, something lands on your table that's like, and so I just have my page proofs for my new book on the ethics of Jesus. My page proofs. The first pass at the page proofs arrived, and so I've got to go through that, and you have to read through them carefully, word by word, make sure there are no misspellings or mistakes or stupid things you say, and so that's time consuming on top of other things, but it's kind of fun to see that, you don't have to do the research anymore, at least.
Are page proofs essentially the manuscript laid out as it will be published?
Yeah, what happens is when you submit the manuscript, then a copy editor, first the editor goes over it and suggests changes, either millions or a few. And then the copy editor, when you make those, the copy editor goes through to make sure that it's the grammar and the spelling and everything, punctuation's right. Then you have to go through all that. Then they set it up the way it'll be in the book, and those are the page proofs. And at Simon & Schuster, the company I work with, is you do that, you send that back, the changes you need to make, and then they send you another set. It's a never-ending story. It just goes on forever.
And eventually you get a book published.
Eventually you get a book published. You think you're done when you're done. You're not done. So, all right. So, how's your busy life?
Good. Busy. Similarly, but no, good. Everything is ticking along as it should be. We've got Halloween in a few weeks, so I'm kind of in the throes of costume creation. We're making pirate costumes, and Oliver and I have spent a few weeks making a giant treasure chest out of cardboard, which he's quite excited about. He wants to fill the whole thing with candy.
Of course he does.
Yeah, given it's about 2 feet high, I'm not sure that's economically viable. I'm trying to persuade him that we can just put a tray insert in the top so it looks full of candy.
All right, fair enough.
But so far, he's not. Yeah, he's not going for that yet.
Well, ambition is good.
It is.
It can be good.
Now, before we get to the topic proper, I wanted to ask a question about whether your academic interests or research interests have changed over the years, or if they've kind of remained relatively stable.
Oh God, no, they've changed all over the place in good ways. Always in expansion. When I first got interested in doing a PhD in New Testament studies, I was interested only in analyzing Greek manuscripts and comparing Greek manuscripts of the New Testament to each other. But I knew to get a job teaching, I'd have to be able to teach kind of broadly in New Testament. And most of my training was actually in New Testament interpretation and the history of early Christianity. So not in analyzing manuscripts. But then when I got this job at Chapel Hill, it was supposed to be a job in ancient Mediterranean religions broadly. And my first PhD seminar that I taught at UNC Chapel Hill was on Greek and Roman religions. And that was a crash course for me to begin with, because it was not what I was trained in. But I did I taught myself a lot of stuff. I read millions of things, and now that's something that I do. But then after I wrote my textbook on the New Testament, after I spent years writing stuff on the New Testament, I got especially even more interested in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century Christianity. And so most of my PhD classes over the years have actually been on 2nd and 3rd century Christianity. And that continues to be an interest. And there's so many topics within that. So, when I write books, they're usually very different kinds of things. And that's great. So, so my interests have definitely changed. They developed. And when I've acquired new interests, I haven't lost my interest in the old interests. And so it's kind of cumulative, which is good.
Excellent. Thank you. Now, We're talking about, as I said in the beginning, Genesis 1 and 2 and the creation stories found within those. You're primarily a New Testament scholar. Genesis is obviously a book of the Old Testament. How often have you had to talk about these passages in Genesis?
Well, yeah, roughly my entire career. And so my secondary field in my PhD, both my master's and my PhD, my secondary field was Hebrew Bible. And so early on, like my first semester in my first master's 3-year master's program, my first semester, I took Hebrew. and so I had to, I had to learn Hebrew and deal with the Bible in Hebrew. And Genesis 1 and 2 is obviously really, really important for anybody who's a Bible scholar, because it's the beginning of the Bible. And these are passages that people still read a lot and believe. And they obviously created huge problems in the history of Christianity over the last 200 years, especially 300 years, because of developments of science. And so they are passages that are important to the Bible. They're passages important to Judaism. They're passages important to Christianity, and they're naturally important to anybody who's a biblical scholar.
Now, for those who aren't familiar with them or with the book as a whole, what does Genesis contain? What is it primarily interested in recording?
The entire book of Genesis, or these 2 chapters? The entire book?
The entire book, then we'll get to the section.
Yeah. Well, so Genesis is the first book of the Pentateuch: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that were traditionally ascribed to Moses. Moses was said to have authored these. He's the main figure in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. He's the one that leads the people out of Egypt during the Exodus, and to whom God gives the law. And a good chunk of those books are about Moses and the law and the Exodus. But Genesis is kind of a setup for that. So the word Genesis means something like beginnings, and it begins at the beginning with the creation of the world. With God creating the world. And then the book of Genesis it's kind of setting up what's going to happen at the Exodus, because the Exodus begins with the children of Israel being enslaved in Egypt. And Genesis, in a way, is kind of setting that up, because it begins with what scholars call the primeval history. So, like, kind of history before there's history. There's the creation. There's Adam and Eve. They're getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden. There's Cain and Abel, and then eventually, and there's a flood, the Noah's flood, and the Tower of Babel, and all of that happens in the first 11 chapters. And then, starting chapter 12, a man called Abram, later renamed Abraham, is called by God because the world is corrupt again, and he calls one person, and he's going to make descendants from this one person his chosen people. And so Jews are the descendants of Abraham. And so it goes there for chapters 12 through 50, through Abraham and his son Isaac and his son Jacob and his 12 sons. And it goes through that way up to the end of Genesis.
Now, the first 2 chapters specifically are creation accounts. They, like you said, they're a primeval history. They kind of start with the creation of the physical world. Now, they're understood by scholars to be distinct and separate narratives composed by different people. Can you tell us about some of the differences in between the 2?
I think a lot of people just read these and just assume it's the same thing. But one thing I do with my students when I teach Hebrew Bible, or just in any kind of context where this is involved, I just have them go through the book of Genesis, chapter 1, and it gives the account of God creating the world and everything in it in 6 days, and then resting on the 7th. And I just have them list, okay, what happens when? First, God does this, then he does that, then he does this, he does the other thing. And again, I go through the days of creation and what gets created when. Then I have them do the same thing with Genesis chapter 2. When is the first thing created? What's next? What's next? What's next? And then compare their lists. And they've never thought about doing that. A lot of them have read these books before. It never occurs to them to have done that. Once they do it, they look at their list and say, what? Wait a second. That doesn't seem to work. Yeah, it doesn't seem to work. In other words, so Genesis 1 gives the account of creation in 6 days. Genesis 2 focuses on the creation of Adam. And then Adam and Eve and everything else. But when you look at the way they're set up, it's clearly they're very different.
If we look specifically at the creation of humans, What are the main differences there between the two accounts?
So the way Genesis 1 works is in the beginning, God creates the heaven and the earth, and the first thing he says is, "Let there be light," and light is created, and it goes from there. He creates light. He creates a dome to separate the waters from above from the water below. He's creating the physical world, and then he ends up creating plant life, and then he creates the animals of the air and the sea, and the climax is on day 6 when God creates humans. He creates them male and female. And so this is the final thing of creation. It's the climax of creation. And you can see this kind of continuum from creating things that are not alive, like the earth, to things that are alive, like the various kinds of animals, to finally the pinnacle of life, which is he creates humans.
How does Genesis 2 differ? If Genesis 1 has humanity kind of being the pinnacle of God's creative efforts, where does humanity fit in Genesis 2?
Well, the interesting thing is that in both Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, the creation of humans is the point. Because it's so in Genesis 1, it's the climax. In Genesis 2, it's the beginning. It's the first thing God does. And my students note that it says quite explicitly that before God had created any of the plants or any of the animals or anything else, first he created Adam. And so it begins with him taking dust of the earth and forming it into a humanoid shape that's looks like a human on the ground, but it's just this stuff made out of dirt. And then he breathes into it. And this being on the ground then becomes a living being. And that's how Adam comes into existence, because God breathes life into him. Um, and that's before there are any plants or before there are any animals. The animals end up getting created because Adam's kind of lonely and he needs some help. So God tries the animals. None of them work. And then he ends up creating woman at the end. So the man is created first. The woman's created last, and in between them are the plants and the animals.
And in Genesis 1, men and women are created at the same time?
Yeah, apparently it says so. I mean, there are all sorts of difficulties with these passages, but in Genesis 1 is where God says, "Let us create humans in our own image, male and female. He created them." And he creates them like he created everything else. He speaks a word and it happens. So when he says, "Let there be light," boom, there's light. And then, and he says, let the earth produce fruit. Boom, it produces, plants. And so he just speaks things and it happens. And so it happens simultaneously in Genesis on the 6th day that both men and women are created male and female.
So, what do these differences tell us or tell scholars about the interests and the concerns of the people who wrote them?
Well, for one thing, the people who wrote these things are not interested in modern science. And so when you actually look carefully at these, it is interesting. A lot of people have pointed out that if you look at the 6 days of creation, the basic structure is kind of like how it happened. That the first thing that happens is you get inanimate stuff created, and this world comes into existence, and and that plants are the first to emerge on the world, and then various kinds of animals emerge, and then humans emerge last. And so, like, generally, it's sort of how things happened. But it's clear they don't. It's not a scientific understanding of things for several reasons. I mean, to begin with, the first thing that God does is he creates light, and then he separates the light from the darkness. So somehow it wasn't separated before that. But the odd thing is that God, he creates light, the very first thing, but he doesn't create the sun, moon, and stars until day 4. So where's the light coming from? But not only that, but before day 4, before there's a sun, moon, and stars, he creates the plants. Photosynthesis wasn't kind of available to the scientific world when these things were written, because he's got plants before he's got a sun. What? And he's got light before there's any sources of light. And so it's kind of, it doesn't. So I think the first thing to be said is that, what this person is valuing is not what many people today value, which is really trying to understand what actually happened. People try to take this text and kind of mold it into modern understandings of the universe, so let there be light. Oh, Big Bang, and so you kind of try to do it, and you end up saying, well, it says 6 days, but it doesn't mean 6 days. It means geological periods, and so these days are millions of years long, billions of years long, or whatever. And when you actually look at this text, it's clear that none of that's right. I'll just say this about the day thing. This text really means days. It means a 24-hour day. One way you know that is at the end of each day, it says, and there was evening and there was morning the first day. Well, evenings and mornings tells you he's thinking in terms of a 24-hour day.
When did scholars first start to really notice that these are probably different accounts rather than the same account, either separated or written in a slightly different fashion?
Well, so there are two kind of issues. One is that, when did scholars start recognizing that these can't be scientifically accurate? And when did they start recognizing that there actually seem to be two different accounts? And for that, which is what you're asking about, I mean, rabbis throughout the centuries have recognized difficulties like this in the text. And rabbis would have, devised ways of trying to understand how they both can be true, and develop sophisticated ways of interpretation to try and account for the differences. But the differences really are clear to anybody who reads them quite carefully. And so that itself is not a modern discovery. I think the modern discovery is that recognizing these differences that are significant on numerous levels leads to an understanding of where these accounts came from, because it's so among the differences, you definitely get a different order of creation, of what's created when, and there are contradictions between these two accounts. The writing style is different between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Just the literary style is different. God has a different name in Genesis 1 from Genesis 2. And so, he's called different things. And so they're like this range of things that people start paying close attention to. And that's what leads in the modern period to the understanding that we're probably dealing with two different authors here.
I see. And do we know, I'm assuming we do know because we have books. When did this kind of understanding of two different authors really start to take off in biblical scholarship?
Well, it had been floating around. I mean, all of these things, just about everything we talk about in here can be traced back to the Enlightenment. I mean, it's when people started recognizing that the Bible, there are people who began recognizing the Bible is a very human book. And for many of these people, it didn't mean it also was not a divine book. It could be both divine and human. But if it's human, we have to take seriously its human characteristics. And of course, in the Enlightenment, you start getting deists, for example, and other people who kind of continue. They believe in a God, but they don't think that they don't think truth comes from revelation from God, and that truth comes by looking around the world and figuring it out. And that's how science develops. You can't have science if you think that everything comes to you by revelation. There's no reason to do an experiment. Just, you'll get the revelation. And so the idea of there being different authors began most seriously in the 19th century. And scholars tried to puzzle out why you have, not just in Genesis 1 and 2, but throughout Genesis and throughout the entire Pentateuch, why it is that you've got these contradictory these contradictions going on all over the place. Why are there different writing styles? Why are there different names for the deity? Why is this all of this? And it kind of came to a climax in the middle of the 19th century or so, and it was developed by a German scholar called Wellhausen. He didn't make all this up, but he kind of developed it into a system that continued to be significant for scholars, probably still today in some ways. But Wellhausen came up with the idea that he didn't come up with the idea. He popularized the idea that the Pentateuch, the 5 books of allegedly of Moses, in fact, are made up of 4 different sources, written at 4 different times by 4 different authors that themselves were based on earlier traditions and stories and things. But so this is called the 4 source hypothesis, and it's J, E, D, and P. They're called. There are different reasons for these sources are identified by those initials. And so some people will have heard of the JEDP theory or the documentary hypothesis, and that's what it's referring to, that you get different accounts. And so some parts are J, some are E, some are D, some are P.
Thank you. We're not going to dive down that particular rabbit hole this week because that is at least 3 episodes all by itself. We're going to take a very brief break. I've got a couple of announcements and then we'll get right back to the conversation. We are excited to announce a brand new discussion series called Face to Face on the Bible. These are live, moderated conversations where 2 leading scholars engage in a friendly exchange on hot-button issues in biblical studies. Our first events will be held on October 21st and October 26th and will feature 3 discussions on the Gospel of John. On October 21st at 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, AJ Levine and Hugo Mendez will discuss history and propaganda in John. On Sunday, October 26th, there will be 2 more sessions, one at 11 p.m. Eastern with Paula Fredrickson and Robin Walsh on the historical reliability of John, followed at 2:30 p.m. Eastern by Mark Goodacre and Bart Ehrman, we know that man, on whether John knew the synoptics. Bart, why are we doing this?
Well, I've got to say, this was my brainstorm. I've been involved with a lot of debates before, but it's what I think. I just thought, people would love to hear 2 scholars who are experts on something talk about it. Often there'll be differences. So I don't know with the other 2 face-to-faces. I don't know how much these others disagree with each other. I don't know, but I know Mark Goodacre and I disagree on whether the author of John knew the synoptic gospels, but it's not going to be a debate. We're not going to be like going at each other. We're just going to be like, he's going to say what he thinks. I'm going to say what I think. We'll talk about why we think what we do. It's going to be a friendly exchange of ideas by people who really have thought about this stuff for decades. And so I just think this is going to be really enlightening. I'm really looking forward to the other 2 because these are 4 people who really know their stuff. Oh my God. And so, and I don't know what they're going to say. I don't know what they're going to say. So I'm really interested in it. I think this is something that people want to tune in on. Because I mean, a couple of years ago, I was at a Society of Biblical Literature meeting with my editor, and he and I were going back and forth about some kind of problem. And he finally said, there are people who would just love to be listening in on this. I said, yeah, I know, it just doesn't happen. And so the idea is to make it happen.
It's the kind of thing that happens in conference hotel rooms or conference rooms after the actual papers are done. You're sitting, you're having a coffee or a drink, and you're just chatting with your colleagues, discussing stuff like this.
And you're getting down there and you're talking about stuff you're both interested in, and you're able to do it. And you realize, most people have no idea that we do this kind of thing. I'm really looking forward to this.
It's going to be a lot of fun. I think I'm moderating at least 2 of them, possibly 3.
I have to say, I'm not looking forward to doing this with Mark Goodacre because he knows everything about this stuff. It's like, oh my God, he spends his life. This is what he does. So that'll be interesting.
But it will be kind and friendly. So
It will be kind and friendly.
So if people are interested in that, you can register online. Tickets are $39.95 per session. But right now you can grab a special launch deal. You buy one session, you get two free at bartehrman.com/face-to-face. Again, there are 3 sessions. So if you buy just one of them right now, you'll get all 3 at bartehrman.com/face-to-face. And 2 final notes. If you are in BSA, you can get this free as part of your subscription. And as always, please remember to use the code MJPodcast for a special discount. And now we're going to head back on over to our conversation on Genesis 1 and 2. So, Bart, we kind of talked about what some of the key differences are between the creation stories in these 2 passages and how biblical scholars started to kind of formalize their thoughts about these differences and the implications that had for understanding the composition of the Pentateuch. I want to turn now to how this impacts people from a faith perspective. So why is it, do you think, these passages can pose a problem for Christians who want to take the Bible as being an accurate, factual account of the creation of the world?
So yeah, this is the I think this is the even the bigger problem, from bigger than whether there are different sources behind it and things. But anybody who holds to a very literal understanding of the Bible as being literally true in everything that it says and everything it affirms has a problem with books like this. The problems began to emerge in the 19th century for 2 reasons. One was they started discovering other accounts of stories like in Genesis, like the creation and the flood. They started discovering other accounts in more ancient civilizations that sounded a lot like what you get in Genesis, both the flood and the creation. And so you have creation stories, as you know, in your field, in the ancient Near East, for example, in Sumerian. You have these much older texts that are that have similar things, and that you can show ties and to the Genesis accounts. And so when these discoveries were made, it made the front page news. I mean, this was like big because did the author of Genesis get this from some other like non-Jewish source? I mean, what? And so there was that. But then the second thing is just about the same time, you have scientists who are developing things like understanding the age of the earth and understanding how the world came into existence, how life began to some extent, but also especially how life evolved. And it became pretty clear with Darwin that humans were not the first thing created, as stated in Genesis chapter 2. Absolutely, humans were not the first thing created. And people started, just with the basics of science, when you realize that you can't have plants without a sun. and so the science started coming about. These other discoveries started coming about, and this was a real source of problem for especially for Christian believers who had taken the Bible as literally true. And in part, it's what led to Christian fundamentalism. It led to Christian fundamentalism because those who thought the Bible must be literally true had to double down on their views. Because otherwise they thought they would lose their entire tradition. They'd lose, the whole faith. And so they doubled down so that now not just the Bible's accurate, the Bible's like every single word is accurate. It's got to be. And so that was the beginning of fundamentalism. So I think it's those combination of those 2 things generated doubt, and they still generate doubt for many people today who think that, what do I do about this if it's not true historically?
When you were a fundamentalist, was this something that you were aware of, or did you read the 2 accounts and, like many other people, not quite realize, hang on, there are discrepancies here?
Well, we knew all about the idea that there were discrepancies or the idea that this couldn't be literally true because we attacked those views. We said, yeah, those non-believers, they're all going to hell. They don't know. This is revealed truth. And so we knew about it, but we had pretty ingenious ways of trying to reconcile it all so that it fit with science, basically, and it fit with and they fit with each other. These two accounts are reconcilable.
Well, let's start with how people harmonize the two accounts themselves. What are some of the ways that you used, or some of the things that you've seen since then?
I haven't seen too much since then because I think the ways we did it are probably the ways most people try to do it still, I think. They may not use this analogy, but the analogy that I always found effective when I was a conservative evangelical was that you had to think about Genesis chapters 1 and 2 as kind of like what happens when you read the sports page. When you read an article on the Super Bowl or something, the first paragraph will give you the kind of the summary story, about kind of boom, 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 boom. And then it goes into the play-by-play after the first paragraph. And you're just kind of used to reading the sports page like that. And so we thought that's kind of like Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1 goes through the sequence. This is what happens, a summary of the sequence of happened. And Genesis 2 then picks up the story specifically with the creation of Adam. And that this is going into the fuller story and expanding it. And so it may, they may look like a contradiction, but in fact, it's not. It's simply a retelling of this one major aspect of the story, the one that really matters, which is the creation of humans.
How then did you reconcile or explain the fact that in Genesis 1, animals are created first, and then in Genesis 2, Adam is created and then animals afterwards?
Yeah, well, we didn't explain it very well because it says, Genesis 1 says this is when all the animals were created, and Genesis 2 says none of them were created yet. So I don't know, man. It's just like, but I guess we would say something like God created animals in Genesis 1. In Genesis 2, when Adam needs some help and needs helpers, God created specific other animals to be potential helpers. And so they're talking about two different acts of creation.
I see. Thank you.
Which doesn't work, by the way, but it's what we said. If you actually read it closely, the problem is when he says like no animals existed yet, or no plants existed yet. Yeah.
So that kind of answers how people try to reconcile the two accounts. How did you try to minimize or discount the differences between the creation accounts in the Bible and what science was starting to explain about the creation of the world and the universe?
Well, when I was really hardcore as a fundamentalist, we just said science was wrong. That we had, experts who would explain kind of holes in the problem of evolution and things that evolution cannot explain. And it makes no sense that you can have life evolve out of non-life. It makes no sense that humans evolve out of lower forms of primate because we have aspects to our existence that primates don't have, and they had to be given by God. And when you look at the creation, you look at the world, and you say things like, if the balance of things in terms of like elements is different by much, or if temperatures are different by half a degree here or there, what you come up with these things like life could not exist, and so it can't be an accident, right? Because it's just like it can't be an accident. If it's not an accident, because evolution's an accident, and so it can't be an accident. And so it's more like it's built on kind of religious common sense. That it just makes better sense that if, for example, if all humans have the same kind of moral code, that can't come from evolution. And so we have consciousness. How do you explain consciousness if we came out of rocks? It doesn't make any sense. And so it wasn't that we were taking them on scientifically. Although we would always have guest speakers that would explain to us that why evolution didn't work on scientific grounds, or why there really was a flood on scientific grounds, and they, and it was nonsense. Frankly, it was nonsense. But we didn't know. And so I think that still happens today. You hear something, it sounds like something you'd be more ready to agree with, makes more sense, so you believe that rather than what can be demonstrated.
I was going to finish up by asking if you thought any of these harmonization attempts were successful, but I suspect the answer is just going to be a very resounding no.
You can try, and I did for years, tried to reconcile all these things. And I finally just got to a point where I felt like I just had to be more honest with myself. And I have students today at Chapel Hill who are very, very smart people, and who do try to reconcile everything. And I don't tell them, no, you can't do that. I mean, yeah, I encourage them to keep trying to do it, but I point out, but you still have this problem, or you still have that problem, and so they end up having to decide. They end up having to decide for themselves, and so I think I think the problem is that people see what they want to see, and often there are other factors involved with deciding what's true, other than what's really true. Because they'll hear something and it's what they want to think, and so they're more inclined to think it. I mean, of course, there's all sorts of psychological studies about that. It's a very big problem in our society. Genesis 1 and 2, yeah, okay, that's a problem if you really think it's literally true. But people who are inclined to think that something is true because a person is saying what they want to hear is a very big problem for us now, socially and politically, in this country and throughout the world. And it's rooted in the same mentality that you're not interested in what the science says. Science is suspect. Expertise is suspect. And who cares if this experiment proves that? I think this other thing. And it's usually because somebody says so that you like and you trust. And I think that it's very dangerous, because so a study like this with my students, I say, look, your life is not going to depend on whether Genesis 1 and 2 are reconciled with each other, but your life's going to be affected if you're able to develop reasons for thinking what you think, and you actually have evidence for what you think rather than just agreeing with somebody you happen to like.
Thank you very much. I think that's a perfect end point. We are going to take a very brief break, and then we'll be back with this week's bonus section, which is audience Q&A.
If you're interested in the Gospels of the New Testament, the book of Genesis, the resurrection of Jesus, the historicity of the Exodus, or anything else connected with the Bible, you should check out my online courses, where I cover all these topics and more. If you'd like to learn about the courses, check them out at bartehrman.com. You can receive a discount on any of your purchases simply by entering the code MJPodcast.
All right. First question. What can you tell us about the lost years of Jesus, and whether there is any evidence of him visiting India or Egypt during that time?
Well, by definition, the knowledge is lost. So we'll begin with that. And so, with all history of every kind, we're dealing with probabilities. And so there are some things that are relatively certain, and some things are virtually certain, and some relatively certain. And so what we need to ask ourselves is, how likely is it that somebody born in a tiny little hamlet in a rural part of the backwoods of the Roman Empire, where everybody was living a hand-to-mouth existence, and just to survive meant that everybody who was capable of working the fields would be out there working, and where there's no education, no schools, and in that kind of impoverished setting, what's the likelihood that somebody like that would go to India? Well, we have no records of people like that ever going to India. Did Jesus go to India? Well, So that's one thing. The likelihood is very likely not. The second thing to be said about it is this idea that Jesus went to India and he studied with the Brahmins, or that he went down to Egypt and he learned the ways of the magicians in Egypt. You get these various stories. We can trace the origins of these stories. They originated in forged gospels in the 19th century. People just exercising their imagination and coming up with stuff. He was in Nepal, or you come up with this fantastic story of you discovered a manuscript in a monastery, and so. But these things they've all been exposed, and I have a chapter of this in my book called Forged, where I talk about these forgeries, talking about Jesus going off to India and whatnot, and how we know that they were just completely fabricated by people who wanted to sell books, and they did.
In Mark chapter 13, Jesus foretells the coming destruction of the second temple, saying, "Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until these things have taken place." Mark 13:30 seems to indicate the coming kingdom of heaven will happen during the lifetime of his disciples. Why then do most Christians not interpret the kingdom of heaven as having already come about with the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD, given that seems to fit his apocalyptic prophecy?
Well, there are certainly Christians who do believe that, who say that the kingdom of God came with the destruction of Jerusalem. That interpretation, in my view, originated among people who wanted to say that Jesus must have told the truth, that he must have been right. He said it was going to come then, so it did come then. And so they come up with this interpretation that it actually happened. Most Christians don't find that compelling because the kingdom of God has not arrived. You may think it's arrived, but I don't see it. Is the lion lying down with the lamb? And so Jesus says that when that happens in that very chapter, the sun will turn dark, the moon will turn to blood, the stars will fall from the sky, the Son of Man will come and collect his elect, and that there'll be an actual complete overturn of history and the world as we know it, and that did not happen. If you say, well, is he just speaking metaphorically about the destruction of the temple? Well, some people say, well, it came in the church. The church is the kingdom of God. Not the local churches I've been involved with, I've got to tell you. And so I think it's a way of just trying to make sense of something Jesus said, saying, well, he must have been right. But it doesn't really work with what he says about the coming kingdom of God.
Thank you. How did early Christians conceptualize sin? The 7 deadly ones weren't properly refined until St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. So how was sin understood before this?
Well, there's a complicated history to the term sin. I have 2 or 3 friends who've written entire books on sin in the Bible. And so my colleague Joseph Lamb at UNC and my good friend Jeffrey Syker have both written extensively on this concept of sin. And it's problematic knowing what the term means in both Greek and Hebrew. It's not that problematic. The Greek word for sin, hamartia, just means falling short of the mark. And it has to do it like it's used a lot for like archery. Like you're shooting at the target, man, you miss it completely. That's a hamartia. But then if you fall short of God's mark, then that's a sin. And so I would say the earliest Christians understood sin. The basic understanding was that it was an act of disobedience against God. They didn't have the concept yet of original sin, that everybody has this kind of sin nature in them. But that's typically how they understood sin, as an act of transgression against God, which involved offending God, which required a punishment, which is why Jesus died. I think that's the basic idea.
Thank you. Final question for the day. The prosperity gospel has become increasingly popular over the last several decades. Are there examples of the prosperity gospel or the connection between faith and wealth in early Christianity? And if not, when did it start taking off as a popular ministry?
I deal with this a little bit in my forthcoming book on the ethics of Jesus, because the prosperity gospel is not just kind of different from what Jesus said. It's absolutely the opposite of what Jesus preached. Jesus did not preach that you will get rich here on earth if you follow what God wants. Jesus taught that you're supposed to give away everything. You're supposed to give up wealth, and that if you have any interest in wealth, your interest is in the wrong place, because you should have treasure in heaven, not treasure on earth. And so these prosperity preachers are, I think, man, it's not just that they're kind of getting a little bit wrong; they're getting it precisely wrong from a point of view of the New Testament. And so too, for example, in the book of Acts, all the followers of Jesus sell everything they have to give to the poor and to distribute among the poor among themselves. And so, no, you do not find prosperity gospel preaching in the entire first century of Jesus, after Jesus. The prosperity gospel itself is a fairly modern phenomenon. I don't know the exact origins. There are a lot of books written on the prosperity gospel by people who are actual scholars talking about the origins and such. But it goes back to the idea that if you ask God, that the God will reward you, and God will answer your prayer, and that if you give, you'll get. And so it's based on that. But in almost every case, it involves preachers who themselves are getting very rich, some of whom I've known. Who are getting rich on the backs of people who are giving money to their ministry, even though it requires huge sacrifice on the people's part. And so it has a very, very negative side to it, I think.
Thank you very much, Bart. Audience, thank you all for your questions. Now, Bart, before we finish for the week, would you mind reminding us what we spoke about today?
Well, we went to the beginning, Genesis 1 and 2, and we dealt with some of the differences between these two accounts, and there appear to be contradictions, and that they're written by different authors at different times, and how this has caused problems for people who are believers, because the accounts of how the world came into existence do not seem to be accurate as to how it really did come into existence, and so how does somebody deal with that?
Thank you very much. Audience, thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please subscribe to the podcast to make sure you don't miss future episodes. Remember also that if you buy one session of the face-to-face on the Bible conversations, you will get the other two absolutely free. So go to bartehrman.com and check that out. Remember also that you can use the code MJPodcast for a discount on all of Bart's courses over at www.bartehrman.com. Misquoting Jesus will be back next week. Bart, what are we talking about next time?
Well, next time we're shifting gears. We're moving up to historical Jesus. And is Jesus and John the Baptist, were they related to the Essenes, the ones who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls? Were they like were they members of the Dead Sea Scrolls community? We'll find out.
Thank you all, and goodbye. This has been an episode of Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman. We'll be back with a new episode next Tuesday, so please be sure to subscribe to our show for free on your favourite podcast listening app or on Bart Ehrman's YouTube channel so you don't miss out. From Bart Ehrman and myself, Megan Lewis, thank you for joining us.